plenty of forensic evidence that supports this case. And the defense is focused on the skull and the anthropologists who have testified. But I expect the prosecution to come back on rebuttal and really talk about the blood, talk about the cadaver dogs, talk about all the other evidence that does support a guilty verdict in this case. So again, I know what the defense is doing here because they're focused on the evidence that isn't particularly conclusive, but there's a lot of bad evidence for the defense, including Mark Redwine's own actions after his son went missing.
Absolutely. All right, crime analyst. Neama, I want to ask you, the bottom line, according to attorney John Bogan there, is the damage to Dylan Redwine, he says, quote, was overwhelmingly caused naturally, he says, by an animal. That's his bottom line here, and he's trying to convince the jury of that, right?
Derek, he is trying to convince the jury, but that's a logical leap that really isn't supported by the evidence. Frankly, we don't know, and that's what the experts testified, because the bones, the remains, they were dismembered. They were found years later, miles apart, and none of the experts could definitively say what caused Dylan Redwine's death. But again, now we're shifting to the meat and potatoes of the case, the really strong evidence that the prosecution has, and you know it's strong because that's what they led with, the really strange, bizarre relationship between father and son. So I'm really interested to see how they address the evidence that the state has that clearly points to Mark Redwine's guilt.
Right. Seeing the defense attorney here, Justin Bogan, really try to discredit all of the forensic evidence that seemed to have stacked up against the defendant here, Mark Redwine.
Derek, this is a tough case for the defense, but I like what they're doing here in closing argument. They're focused on the evidence that isn't particularly helpful to them. By them, I mean the prosecution. Obviously, that's the skull. Those are the other remains. Not a whole lot that definitively proves that Mark killed Dylan. The blood, but again, I think the state's going to come back and say no one's alleging that this is a bloodbath and there's tons of blood, but the defense is focused on really this is a small amount of blood, so it's not really consistent with a gory murder scene. I'm interested to see how they finish up the dog argument, but I'm most interested to see what they do with respect to Mark Redwine's own statements and his conduct towards his son. I think as jurors who are parents, they're going to say, is this conduct consistent with someone who cares about his missing son, or is it more consistent with someone that had something to do with his disappearance?
Yeah, the motive here, and at least that's what the prosecution claims, is that, believable in terms of a father killing his own son? Pictures showing the dad in a compromised position?
Well, it's certainly plausible. Again, the jurors coming in, they're going to bring in their own experience to that courtroom and that jury deliberation room. And the love that a parent has for their child, there's nothing greater than that. So the question they're all going to be asking is, what could possibly cause a father to kill his own son? This is similar to the Baby Joe case, the last case that you and I covered here on Law and Crime, Derek. And the question here is, you have someone who is certainly a very different individual. I don't question anyone's lifestyle choices, but that's certainly fringe and really extreme behavior. And the fact that it's something that Mark Redwine didn't want the public to know and wanted to cover up, just adds to the already very strange, bizarre, distant, and strained relationship between him and his son. And I think that's something that the jury will absolutely consider when deciding whether there's motive for Mark to kill Dylan here.
All right. For a young boy to have to sit through.
Yeah, poor Corey, as well as Dylan's mom, they've had to sit through this. They've had to testify. I mean, we always forget the families really are the real victims here. Someone's lost their son, someone's lost their brother, and it's just incredibly heartbreaking. And this is what we expected during closing argument. The best defense is a good offense. With respect to this bad testimony that Mark Redwine, not testimony, but statements that he gave law enforcement, that the defense was going to come after law enforcement and say this is a sloppy investigation, this was a rush to judgment. Right. They jumped to conclusions because this is what defense attorneys, good ones, do in every single case when they don't have good evidence.
Not only convince himself, but maybe convince his friend Gene the events and the conversations that they had between them.
Derek, so many fascinating things about this Durst case, but this witness, wow. Gene Clark, looking for love in all the wrong places, meets Robert Durst in this dating group, develops this relationship with him, this fondness for him. And it's interesting how you see the defense theories in this case evolve. One of the direct pieces of evidence is obviously Durst's misspelling of Beverly. And you see, at least at this point, years ago, Durst wants some sort of writing, some form of evidence that says, well, no, I actually spelled Beverly correctly. It wasn't me who sent that note to Beverly Hills PD, the famous cadaver note. Now the defense has shifted, and what we heard in opening statements were actually that Durst stumbled upon Susan Berman's body, got scared, and actually did send that letter to the police department. So it's very interesting, the testimony of this witness and how defense arguments and theories can shift over time.
Had an interest in this witness, Susan Giordano, telling the truth, and was concerned that she might not.
Derek, this is another fascinating witness who Lewin wants to testify. Another woman who apparently, at least according to the prosecution, was romantically involved with Bob Durst, a man that she met after he admittedly killed Morris Black. So here's someone that's been involved in 3 murders or disappearances, and he still manages to find these women who are romantically interested in him. And she went so far as to engage in these financial transactions up to $350,000 reportedly. And not only that, she was involved with moving 60 boxes of material related to the jinx and other materials that Bob Durst had that prosecutors wanted. So she could have been charged with obstruction of justice. She could have been charged with these financial crimes. And what Lewin is trying to do, now that Susan Giordano is lawyered up, is say, no, 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 you don't have a Fifth Amendment privilege because there's no risk of criminal prosecution for these crimes, and therefore we want you to testify. And if the judge didn't buy that, the next step would have been for him to grant her immunity, at least here in California. The problem is it wouldn't immunize her from any crimes out there in New York where all this occurred.
But this was an attempt to maybe bribe this witness on the part of Durst? Well, we can't actually hear Neama right now for some reason. Let's listen in.
Sorry about that, Derek. Had
there you go.
Issues there. Now that we're court's in a break and we have a few minutes, I got to talk about these 2 witnesses, Gene Clark and Susan Giordano, in more detail. I mean, it's just fascinating. These are young women, relatively speaking, at least compared to Bob Durst, who are spending time visiting him in prison, corresponding with him, and these jailhouse calls are just absolutely fascinating. Let's start with Gene Clark first. I mean, she is getting money from Bob Durst. She watches the jinx, and when Durst is discussing the jinx with her, he doesn't say, I didn't do it. He doesn't say that, they got it all wrong. He says, hey, this is going to be really bad for me. So that's not what you would expect from someone who is being falsely accused of murder. And interestingly, Clark never asked Durst directly, hey, did you do this? Were you involved in this? They're alleging that you are in this documentary. She watches it herself. So here's someone who is clearly loyal to Bob Durst, is aligned with him, and that's why John Lewin is able to cross-examine her as a hostile witness. And then turning to Susan Giordano, she's someone who obviously is also receiving money from Bob Durst, but she has all of his files. So when her house is raided and law enforcement wants to get those files, the court has to appoint a special master because her attorneys say, and Bob Durst's attorneys say, hey, there's our attorney-client privilege documents here. These are legal files. So actually, usually a retired judge or an attorney has to go through those documents to make sure there's nothing privileged in there. But let's talk about the money, because that's really a key issue. And I think it cuts both ways, Derek, because the prosecution here is arguing that Susan Berman was killed because she was extorting Durst. And she kept asking for money, $50,000, and if she didn't get it, she was going to go to law enforcement. Well, this kind of cuts both ways, because the defense is going to argue, well, why would Bob Durst kill his best friend of many, many years over $50,000 when he's giving hundreds of thousands of dollars to these other women who apparently are his girlfriends?
Yeah, I mean, and money.
His brother testified that. when he took the stand. And basically, I think it was approximately $60 million they gave Durst to go away and really not have anything to do with the Durst real estate fortune out there in New York. So, and the jurors know that Bob Durst has many attorneys, whereas more or less John Lewin is handling most of the examination on his own. So it's clear this is someone of significant financial means. And again, Lewin is arguing that these witnesses are romantically involved with Durst. They have a reason to lie for him, both because they care for him, potentially they love him, and they're getting paid. And they're getting paid repeatedly by Durst to protect him. So it's part of the bias argument that the prosecution is raising here. But again, it does cut against the potential motive to kill Susan Berman. So it's going to be interesting to see what the defense does with this argument on cross-examination.
Let's talk
here between Durst's physical capacity and his mental capacity. And we know physical capacity is an issue because I think the defense has filed at least 3 motions, maybe more, and it's gone up on the Court of Appeal, arguing that Durst is physically unable to participate in this trial. Now, that's a different argument than the mental capacity issue because, as you mentioned, this is someone who's clearly sharp, who's clearly competent, who's clearly been able to talk his way out of being prosecuted so far, whether it's back in New York in the early 80s or during the Jinx documentary or even a direct interview he had with John Lewin for several hours when he was arrested. So we know he's going to take the stand and he's going to testify, and his testimony is going to be critical to this case.
Right.
And I think that's why Judge Wyndham denied those motions, because even though this is someone who's clearly frail and has serious physical medical issues, at least upstairs, he's as sharp as a tack.
I didn't ask for the money. Yeah, he wanted to send it to me, but it still has this specter of a potential bribe here, right?
It does, and you have Bob Durst. Here's someone who shoplifts, someone who uses food stamps, even though he's worth tens of millions of dollars, but apparently he's very generous, at least when it comes to these women in his life. There's this gift or offer of $1 million. There's apparently hundreds of thousands of dollars to Susan Giordano to make their, quote, love nest and buy a place together. So really 2 very, very different versions of the same person when it comes to finances here.
Yeah, recorded on that bathroom audio of Durst where he said, what the hell did I do? And then says, kill them all, of course. Is that a confession?
Well, it's certainly an admission, and the defense is going to argue 2 things. First, that the recording was edited. This is all fiction, this is all TV, and they're going to play the full unedited recording, and they think that it'll make it clear that Bob Durst is not admitting to being involved in these killings. So that's the first part. The second, they're going to argue, and we've heard so much about drug use in this case, that he was on drugs, and apparently methamphetamine, when this admission was made. And this is probably something that Durst will address head on when he ultimately takes the stand in this case during the defense's case in chief. So, and this is how the defense is going to deal with the direct evidence in this case. This is primarily a circumstantial case. We talked about some of the direct evidence, which is the cadaver note and the misspelling of Beverly. We know how the defense is going to address that and just say that Durst walked in on Susan Berman's body, got scared, but wanted police to find her, and that's why he sent that letter. And now we know how they're going to address the testimony or the evidence at the end of the Jinx, that finale. They're going to address that head on and argue again that it's edited and taken out of context, and really Durst was under the influence of drugs, and that's why it's not something that the jury should consider when reaching its verdict.
Right. I mean, you'd have to think that Durst would at least know he's wearing a microphone, and even though he's in the bathroom, he seems to be whispering to some extent. So it would seem he knows he's being recorded. So, I don't see how the prosecution can really rely on this audio as a confession.
Well, Derek, you know that Bob Durst thought that this was going to be bad for him for a couple of reasons. One, he told his friend, one of which was Gene Clark, that this was bad for him. Second, he apparently tried to flee right before this final episode of the Jinx was aired. He was literally arrested the day before in New Orleans. So for whatever reason, he knew or he thought that this would be bad for him. And this is one of the reasons why John Lewin was able to pick up this case after so many years. Of course, he's a cold case prosecutor. He thought that this was the smoking gun, that piece of evidence that he needed to put him over the edge and prove that Bob Durst killed Susan Berman beyond a reasonable doubt. It absolutely is. And we've talked about why is John Lewin, why is the district attorney's office spending so much time on these other murders? Well, we know Kathy Durst's disappearance and murder is the motive for Susan Berman's murder, which is the charge in this case. But even Morris Black, even a murder on which Durst was acquitted, what the prosecution wants to show is, look, this is someone that people close to him, they disappeared, they died. This is not a frail old man who's incapable of committing these very gruesome acts. So from the prosecution's perspective, even a murder that resulted in acquittal shows that this is a violent individual who's capable of killing, whether it's a friend, execution style, whether it's an ex-wife who was going to leave him, or a neighbor who was on to him. And this is all evidence of the type of person that Bob Durst is and why he's a killer, especially in murder cases. But we know this is not your typical murder case. This is the case, the trial of the century. So there's 3 reasons why we know Bob Durst will absolutely take the stand in this case. The first is that his attorneys have said it during both their openings, before the pandemic and after, when we resumed. The second reason is it's worked in the past. It worked during the Morris Black trial, right, where Durst took the stand and explained everything away. And the third reason is, you know, the prosecution is going to come play that John Lewin interview. You know they're going to play this bathroom testimony during the Jinx. You know they're going to play back portions of the Morris Black testimony that he gave. That's already happened. So Durst needs to take the stand to explain all this away. And there's a good chance that he's successful because he was in the past. The district attorney's office, they've been so incredibly opposed to any continuance in this case. Didn't even want to bring in a new panel of jurors because so many of the witnesses are older. We've already had to record and replace much of the testimony in this case. That's very rare for a criminal trial for this to happen. This is a rarely used provision of the California Penal Code that does allow for it. It's essentially a deposition. You see it in civil, but you rarely see it in criminal. So justice delayed is justice denied. We're already almost 40 years after the disappearance of Kathy Durst, and there's a real possibility that Bob Durst doesn't survive if this case is continued any further.
It's apparently going to these women once the trial is all over.
Derek, if I'm Gene, I'm thinking to myself, how come Susan gets $5 million? I'm only what happened to me? You know, I only get $1 million here. But look, I like what John Lewin's doing. He wants to get out some of these admissions through these witnesses, and they're clearly favorable to Bob Durst, their friends, or maybe even lovers. And you want to get out ahead of any potential bad witnesses, so you call them on direct, you treat them as hostile witnesses, and that way you get control of the narrative. So I really like what Lewin is doing with these particular witnesses here, even though typically this type of cross-examination happens when you're on the defense, not on the offense. One witness who clearly has an attorney in Susan Giordano, an out-of-state attorney, but she's been prepped in a way that maybe Jean Clark was not prepped. So that's why she's a much more of a careful witness, and she knows what to expect during direct examination, even though it's a hostile direct examination, probably in a way that Jean Clark, frankly, just wasn't prepared.
And there's no
hard for us because we're not privy to that sidebar, but I think it's the form of the cross-examination, particularly the transcript being shown to the jury, even though it's an audio recording of a jail call. So I think from the defense's perspective, they believe what should be presented to the witness is the actual audio, not this transcript that we're reading up on the screen. But the audio quality is a bit bad.
So
is of poor quality. It sounds like it's poor quality. It's a recorded jail call, but ultimately it's up to a judge to determine whether that transcript is a fair and accurate depiction of the audio. I expect the judge to allow that transcript in because really you can kind of cross-examine using anything. The question is, should it be shown to the jury without some sort of foundation? So maybe Lewin will have to go back, lay that foundation, and then the actual transcript can and will be shown to the jurors.
Right.
and goes. You know, we're seeing documentaries, we're seeing parts or all of fictional movies, all good things. We're hearing about other murders that have already been adjudicated. So, you know, he's very nice, he's very friendly, and he has a very, let's just say, liberal view when it comes to evidence and what should come in and what should stay out.
Right.
I think Durst has lost some credibility with this judge. Let's not forget, day one, he refused to even come out of his cell. So day two, Judge Wyndham had to actually order LA County sheriffs to go in and remove forcibly Durst from his cell so he can come to court. There's some recorded jail calls where Durst is talking about maybe feigning an illness or a medical condition so the trial gets continued. So I think that may be in the back of the judge's mind when he's hearing these arguments about Durst's medical condition.
Got it.
Moment, and Lewin is really going after this witness as far as her bias is concerned, about her close relationship to Durst, talking about this cruise they're going to take, this love nest they're going to move into together. So I'm excited to see this for the rest of the afternoon and likely into tomorrow.
Right.